All right, everyone. Happy Blur's Day. I hope you're doing well and hope you're safe. This is our third video about church history and sort of the story of Christianity. In the first video, we talked about Christians getting kicked out of the synagogue and how that changed their relationship with or their sort of status in the Roman Empire. They went from being a protected religion to being not protected anymore. And then we talked about Trajan and his policy about Christians. And I also mentioned that it wasn't empire wide. It was sort of the rule of thumb, but it wasn't something that was being enacted throughout the empire. And then in the last video, we talked about Christians sort of rising up and defending Christianity against misconceptions and against the fears of what people thought that it was doing, or thought that thought whatever was going on. And also, these apologists were sort of reacting to the things that are going on in the Roman Empire. Not only are we not doing the kinds of things you're accusing us of doing, but you're doing things that are actually bad and that we're taking a stand against. And so Christians weren't backing down, and so we talked about that last time. And they also weren't always agreeing about the right way to engage in the culture and deal with philosophy and things like that. So there were some, just practical differences and also sort of conceptual theological differences in how to approach things like that. But before we get into today we're going to talk about persecution, which is difficult. It's difficult to talk about, and it's not super exciting. I mean, it's not really like a go get 'em kind of thing to bring up. But I do want to mention the sources that I'm using. So in case you want to dig in more, and I encourage you, if you hear about something, look it up, Google it and check it out. I'm hoping that this is giving you something to do during the week that's productive and good that maybe you weren't exposed to before. But one of the books that I have, and I'm actually borrowing it from a friend, thank you, Quinn, if you're watching, is called 2000 Years of Christ's Power. This is volume 1 because we're very early on. And it's written by Nick Needham. So there's that. Looks like this. And then The Story of Christianity, Volume 1. Looks like this, by Justo Gonzalez. And then I've got a couple over here, Documents of the Christian Church, by Bettinson. And then this one is called Early Church History. It is part of the Zondervan Quick Reference Library, and I like these, and so this is just super. This is actually more of like Acts stuff that's happening in Acts, but am referencing it, and then 131 Christians Everyone Should Know. From the editors of Christian History magazine. Yeah. So anyway, those are some of the books that I'm referencing and using, and then I've also got some software that helps me look into ancient sort of documents and stuff that we have. But anyway, that's what's going on. So yeah, again, super informal. So if I end up rambling, I know that when I'm being a little less formal, I say the phrase I say even though there's no. In the Roman Empire was sort of random. It was sporadic. It was localized. It didn't typically come from the emperor necessarily. It came from local governors. Now, Nero is an exception. So actually, Christian persecution from Rome really started with Nero, but Nero was nuts. He was crazy. And there was a fire in 64 AD, and everyone was accusing Nero of having started the fire, because he had this big plan to start something in Rome, to build something. So everyone accused him of lighting the fire that burned Rome. And so he turned around and accused Christians. And there's a Roman historian. He's not a Christian historian, but there's a Roman historian named Tacitus. And I think I read something from him before. But this is something that Tacitus wrote about Nero and about his because Nero was burning Christians in the streets. And so why did that happen? Well, here's what Tacitus wrote about it. He wrote, "In spite of every human effort of the emperor's largesse and of the sacrifice made to the gods, nothing sufficed to allay suspicion nor to destroy the opinion that the fire had been ordered by Nero, that it had been ordered by Nero. Therefore, in order to destroy this rumor, Nero blamed the Christians, who are hated for their abominations, and punished them with refined cruelty." So that's Tacitus telling basically from the Roman perspective of what happened when the Christians were getting persecuted. And he says it was because Nero was getting blamed, and Nero wanted to shed that blame, so he shed it toward Christianity. And then the temple fell, and then about 10 years after that, Christians basically got kicked out of the synagogues. And there had already been, as you heard in Tacitus, even in the time of Nero, Christians were hated. So let's get this out of the way. Christianity will always be persecuted. Our Lord and Savior, the one who we follow, was tortured. It was put on trial in some kind of a midnight trial farce. And he was put on trial. He was tried. He was convicted. He was tortured. And then he was killed, even though he had not done anything wrong. So that's our Lord. We follow him. He's our master and commander. He's the captain of our ship. We give our lives to him and we follow him. That's what happened to him. Christianity will always be persecuted. It's just part of what we have to endure being in this world. It's just part of it. We inherit this hope of being in heaven with Jesus, but we also inherit a present persecution in different ways, in different times, but it really starts with Jesus, and then it continues all the way through today. In the Roman Empire, persecution was, like I said, it was local and it was sporadic, and it depends on who is the emperor. And there were lots of emperors, and the emperors had to deal with civil wars, and sometimes a civil war would turn into a new emperor because the general of this legion would turn against the empire and would say, "We're the strongest legion, we want our general to become the emperor," and then they would overthrow the current emperor. So there was a lot of shifting in leadership in the Roman Empire. There were a lot of civil wars, a lot of dissent. And then you had barbarian groups from the outside trying to push in, and they had to deal with that too. So there was a lot of shifting in leadership. And so the kind of persecution that was happening to Christians depended on who's the emperor at the time, what's going on in the empire at the time, does the emperor care? And then a lot of that was distributed out, was sort of delegated to the governors of the provinces. And so it really depended on who's the governor at the time, who's the emperor at the time, who's the governor of the time, what kinds of things do they care about right now, who is pursuing Christians, are they pursuing Christians? Like Trajan said, don't pursue them, but if you find out that they're Christians, torture them until they recant or kill them. And so you've got, but it really depends. It's almost like, I want to compare it to the legalization and prosecution of people who smoke marijuana today, because I think that it depends on where you are. Do you have a card for it? Did you go to a doctor? Is it medical? Is it recreational? Is it against the law in your state? Is it against the law federally? And I actually don't know all the answers to those questions, but it really depends on where you are, which and again, going back to Rome and the persecution of Christians, it really depends on where you are, who's in charge of that area, who the governor is at that time, and other factors and other things that are going on. So it wasn't consistent. It was kind of a roller coaster. People were being really heavily persecuted here, but over in that part of the empire, not so much, or not at all. I mean, maybe not at all. That governor doesn't care about Christians at all. They're not worried about it at all, and so they're not getting persecuted, but these ones are horribly sometimes. And then so generally Christians were hated in the empire. Misconceptions sometimes, but also once the misconceptions were kind of gone, it was just a matter of Christians don't worship the gods that we worship. Christians don't burn incense in front of the statue of the emperor. They're treasonous and things like that. Things that the Christians were not denying. That we're not willing to do that. That is not part of what we're going to do. We'll be good citizens in every other way, but no, that's not something that we're willing to consider. And so you had just sort of a widespread, just sort of hatred against Christians. Christianity is growing at the same time, and that's part of the frustration. Again, Christians are being, where there is persecution, it goes from, mild to moderate to severe, just depending on the situation. But it really started in 64 with Nero, who was nuts. Trajan's policy was the first sort of official word from an emperor about how to deal with that since Nero. And that's why I made some comments about it on the first video. And then it continued all the way through until the year 313. And so we're going to basically cover the history of persecution leading up to 313 when it officially ended in the Roman Empire. We're going to try to tackle that. So I wrote myself some notes. I got some things that I want to read to you. There was a Roman emperor. Again, different emperors had different views on whether or not to persecute Christians and the way to handle that. There was a Roman emperor named Decius in 249. He took over the empire, and his goal was to restore the empire to its former glory. So Christianity has, at this point been around for about 200 years. And Christian influence was growing in the empire through all of the persecution. And there's a quote from Tertullian. He's one of the early church fathers, and he wrote just about the kind of hatred that Christians were enduring. He wrote. Tertullian wrote this. He said, "When the Tiber, the river, floods, or the Nile fails to flood, up goes the cry, 'Christians to the lion.'" And there was a common saying in those days, "No rain because of the Christians." And so Christians were getting blamed for anything and everything. They were just sort of broadly hated. That's why the ground was ripe for persecution whenever they felt like it, right? Because there was just this broad hatred of Christians. But Christianity was growing, and their influence was spreading, and they were defending themselves against criticism, and they were being persecuted, and they were being killed, and they were being tortured, and they were staying strong, and they were. The church was growing. There's a saying, and I think it comes from Tertullian, but don't quote me. That the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. That the more people that were dying for their faith, the more people that were drawn toward a faith that people would hold on to in spite of all that suffering and in spite of death. So martyrdom really was was one of the ways that Jesus was growing the church. And these people were not reluctantly dying in the first and second, even in the third century. Christians were not reluctantly dying. That a lot of Christians were jumping, into those situations and were boldly, like Justin Martyr, he's not being soft about his criticism of pagan culture and idolatry. He's coming right after it, and that's why he's a martyr. It was not something it wasn't something that you wanted, but it also wasn't something that they saw as being, we're going to avoid this at all cost. There was an emperor. We're talking about Decius, but right before Decius, there was an emperor called Septimius Severus, and he had demanded that Christians that anyone in the empire, no matter what religion you have, you need to worship the unconquered Son primarily. And that was meant to say, Christians, you can keep your religion. We won't persecute you anymore, but you have to acknowledge that the supreme being is the unconquered Son. And they just weren't willing to do stuff like that. So you had Christians really fighting back and then getting killed because of it. But that martyrdom was increasing the influence of the Christians in the empire. So then here comes Decius in 249. The empire has lost a lot of its paganism, a lot of its the things that ancient Rome was famous for, and had become weaker. And Decius connected those two and said, if I can bring back, I want to bring back ancient Roman glory, I need to bring back ancient Roman ways and ancient Roman worship. And so he required the worship of these ancient Roman gods and making a sacrifice of burning incense in front of his own statue, the statue of Decius. And if you did that, you were given a certificate that said that you were participating, good person in the, you could live essentially in the empire. And if you didn't do it, you weren't given one. And if you weren't given one, you could be killed. And this was a policy, and this is the first Roman Empire policy about Christians in particular, about religion across the empire. So this takes the kind of persecution from being localized, run by governors, going up and down, it depends on where you are, to being around the empire, across the empire. We've found these certificates that are given out because you did the appropriate sacrifice and you worshiped the appropriate gods. We found them around the empire. So we know that empire-wide, this decree went out that if you don't do this, you're going to be it's high treason to not do it. But actually Decius, seeing that martyrdom had grown the influence of the church, he preferred to not make martyrs. He preferred to not kill people. He preferred to turn them into apostates, to force them to reject their faith. So before it was, there was some interrogating and, do you recant? Oh, you don't? Okay, you're dead. And it was fairly easy to kill Christians rather than just to keep interrogating them. But Decius really wanted to convert Christians away from Christianity, to force them to deny their faith and then to become ostracized from the church. And so he preferred prison and torture over death. And the people who got caught up in this, who were imprisoned and tortured and tortured and tortured and not allowed to die, kept alive for the purpose of continuing to be tortured, they became known in the church as confessors. And they were like martyrs, but maybe even more so, seen very, very highly in the church because they just refused in the face of all kinds of horrible punishments. They refused to give up on their faith. And that persecution lasted for 2 years. So it went from 249 to 251, and then and then and then it ended. There was more stuff that happened, after that. And again, it kind of went back to the roller coaster of persecution. Some places it's bad, some places it's not, depending on who's in charge. There was an emperor named Valerian who became emperor, and he started persecutions again. But it didn't last very long. So it just kind of it came and it went. It was here and there. When it was here, it's really quite bad. And people are dying, but the church's influence is growing. And then came an emperor named Diocletian. So Diocletian took the throne, became emperor in 303. Now, Diocletian's wife and his daughter are both Christians. They're both Christians. And Diocletian doesn't seem like he really cares much about Christianity, except he had a kind of an emperor. So Diocletian changed some of the ways that the Roman Empire worked, and there were 4 emperors. There were really 2 emperors and then like an emperor protege. Diocletian was one of them, and the emperor protege underneath him was named Galerius, and Galerius hated Christians. I mean, really hated Christians. And Galerius convinced Diocletian that the Christians were really, really, really bad for the empire. Even though his wife and his daughter were Christians, Diocletian basically started this new wave of persecuting the church, which ended up being the worst persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire in the 200 or 300 years of Christianity being in that Roman Empire for the first 300 years or so of the church. This period of persecution was historians considered to be the absolute worst time. It started off in the army. It started off by they were looking for Christians in the army and were kicking them out of the army. Fine, no big deal. But then that didn't go far enough. It didn't have the effect that they wanted. So then they fired all of the Christians from public offices. So out of the government or any governmental thing, you Christians can't be employed in the government at all. And then they started tearing down all of the buildings. They started tearing down the buildings. Now remember, they're not trying to make martyrs. They're trying to kill Christianity without making martyrs, because martyrdom increases the influence of the church. So they're firing Christians, they're tearing down Christian buildings, and they're burning Christian writings. And then after that, he sort of followed the same torture and turn model that Decius had started, where he didn't really want to kill them, especially. He wanted to do other things. He wanted them to reject their faith. And so they were capturing Christians, they were torturing them. But in 304, so that part of it really only lasted about a year. In 304, he abdicated the throne, but he abdicated it to Galerius, who had been influencing him against Christians in the first place. So the persecution really continued and ramped up. One local emperor had Christians maimed and then sent to work in a rock quarry. So like he would chop off a leg and then send them to work in a rock quarry. The problem was that those rock quarries turned into churches. And these maimed Christians who were being tortured in order to reject their faith, if they didn't reject their faith, they were all being put in the same place. And then they turned themselves into a church and converted all of the other prisoners who had been put in the rock quarry. And so that didn't work. So they started killing those prisoners and moving them and sending them to other places to work, trying to split them up. But really nothing was able to stop the influence of the church and the testimony of Christians who just love Jesus so much that they'll do anything for him. Nothing was able to really stop that. No persecution. not martyrdom, not turning people into confessors, not maiming them and then sending them to work in the rocks. Nothing really worked. But this was a really, really, really bad, horrible period, for Christianity, not for Christianity, but for being a Christian. This was a very difficult time because it was a empire-wide policy that you can't be what you are, and it was very hard. But again, the church continued to sort of endure this, and the strength of the church, the strength of Jesus really showed clearly through that. And then all of a sudden, Galerius got sick, and he changed his policy, and it seems pretty sudden. He changed his policy in the year 311, and I'm going to read to you what his policy, what he wrote. He wrote this. After the promulgation of our edict ordering all to return to the ancient customs, many obeyed for fear of danger. I'm sorry, I lost my spot. Many obeyed for fear of danger, and we were forced to punish others. But there are still many who persist on their opinions, and we're aware that they neither worship nor serve the gods, nor even their own God. Therefore, moved by our mercy to be benevolent toward all, it has seemed just to us to extend to them our pardon and to allow them to be Christians once again. And once again gather in their assemblies as long as they don't interfere with public order. In another edict, we shall instruct our magistrates regarding this matter. In return for our tolerance, Christians will be required, get this, Christians will be required to pray to their God for us, for the public good, and for themselves, so that the state may enjoy prosperity and may live in peace. I'm like, so it's great because all of a sudden, this guy who's been going the hardest in history, the hardest historically after Christians, all of a sudden, he just goes, it's not working. It's not working. And we're gonna allow them to gather, even though they're horrible people and they don't even worship their own God. We're going to allow them to just to do what they're doing, and to assemble together, as long as they pray for us and they don't interfere with public order. 5 days later, Galerius died. 5 days later, he died. And in the sort of political confusion that happened that came after that, there was a diplomat, a politician named Constantine, who had, I don't know, he hadn't necessarily been behind the scenes, but really he made his first sort of military political move in the sort of turmoil that came after that. He moved to take over half of the Roman Empire, and on the eve of his decisive battle, this is sort of how it worked, right? Someone was in charge. If someone else wanted to be in charge, if they had enough power, they would get their troops together, they would go and take over, and are you guys with me? And then we'll have a fight, and then someone else is in power. And so that's kind of how it happened. It was fairly typical. So Constantine is moving to take power. He's moving against, I forgot what his name is. It's Maximilianus or something like that. He's moving against this guy, and on the eve of the battle, he has a dream, some kind of a vision that causes him the next day to put the Greek letters Chi and Rho, which are the first letters of Christ, to put Chi and Rho over the shields. And most people consider this to be the first sort of indication of Constantine's conversion toward Christianity. And so they go into this battle with basically with a symbol for Christ on their shields. He begins to take over. He takes over part of it. Again, there's several different things going on. He takes over part of it, and then he makes an agreement with other leaders called the Edict of Milan. In 313, the Edict of Milan was basically a deal that allowed him to become emperor and also allowed Christianity to become legal in the Roman Empire and stopped persecution against Christians. And there you go. So again, if we want to sort of recap some of the highlights, persecution has been and always will be part of the Christian experience. It goes up, it goes down. It depends on where you are, when you are. There's a lot that it depends on. In the Roman Empire, it was the same way. Nero was crazy. He persecuted Christians, shifting blame away from him. Christians were already hated because they don't worship the gods. They don't worship God. They don't have a God that's a statue. They're doing, weird things with babies. They don't believe the way that we believe. They don't participate in what we do. They don't worship Caesar. Christians were hated. Sometimes that turned into like really bad persecution, depending on what was going on. But the more persecution that there was, the more martyrs there were, the more Christianity grew. The more Christianity grew, the less influence that pagan Roman culture had in Rome. Sometimes there was big backlash against that, like with Diocletian, really didn't like that, and Decius really didn't like that. So they would come back hard against Christianity, but Christianity always flourished in the middle of that. And some of the most vivid stories we have of persecution of that time is stories of women being persecuted. And there's a story of Perpetua and Felicitas, and their martyrdom. I'm probably getting one of their names wrong. These like Roman Latin names are strange to say sometimes. But if you look up the martyrdom of if you Google Felicit, you'll find the whole thing. And there's this story about a young mother who was converting to Christianity, and if you're interested in it, you can read it. It's actually a very compelling story of just faithfulness. And if you look up that story, remember you're talking about converts to Christianity. You're not talking about like well established, long-term veterans in the faith. You're talking about people who just are passionately in love with Jesus and willing to give their lives to show their love for Christ. Converts, people who were preparing to be baptized. Yeah, that's who we're talking about. But Christianity was persecuted ongoingly, up and down, depending on what was going on. But then eventually the influence of Christianity became so great that these emperors who really wanted to just strike down Christianity forcefully had to recognize it's just not working. It's just not happening. And you see with Diocletian that even he had family members who were Christians. It didn't stop him from persecuting Christians, but you do see that influence rising up into the point where he had to fire Christians out of positions of leadership in the Roman Empire because Christians were in leadership in the Roman Empire. And that influence just continued to grow. The more you push it down, the more it came up. So I hope that's encouraging to you. Persecution's a hard thing to go through. It's a hard thing to think about. And if you want to look up some of those stories about, a lot of them are, I don't know if they're myths, but they're not. You're not going to read them about. You're not going to read about them in history books. A lot of the stories that went out there were traditions that we don't have access to sort of early writings about, other than to refer back to the story of. And so anyway, but there's a lot that's going on there. But Jesus promised that I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. And we see that happening historically. We see crazy things happening to try to push the church down. And Jesus just keeps lifting the church up, building up his church. And so in 313, the Edict of Milan legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. And then after that, you see, well, we'll see coming up. I think the next video is actually we're going to cover the same sort of time period, but we're going to talk about the variety of Christian beliefs and some of the things that were coming up theologically within Christianity, some of the conflicts within the church, and the ways that the church was combating against that sort of division. So we're going to come back to this same period of time and talk about a different thing that was happening while all of the persecutions were going wild and crazy throughout the empire. So we talked about conflict sort of coming from outside the church in this video. Next one, we'll talk about some of the conflict and the resolutions happening inside the church at the same time. So I hope this is good for you. I hope you're being good and I hope you're safe. Forgive me for rambling. This video is a little bit longer than I had intended, but it's just a lot to get through. So if you have any questions, let me know. And if I forgot to say something or if I said something wrong, let me know and so I can correct it. But be good and be safe. And thank you for watching.